figure out how I'm going to do this here. Well, how many times do you see one verse, or even a part of the verse in the Bible, and it grabs your attention? And the closer you look, the more you uncover. Pardon the pun, because we're actually going to do a quick study on the uncovering of Adam and Eve. And by that I mean their nakedness. We're going to look into the physical nakedness of Adam and Eve, and in doing so, we'll draw parallels to the spiritual nakedness in our lives. We're going to start in Genesis 2. Early Genesis is where we will spend the majority of our time. We'll go toward the end of Genesis 2. We're picking up on the story of Adam after having named all of the animals. God causes him to sleep in verse 21, removes a rib, closes him back up, creates woman from the rib, still unnamed, brings her to him. Down in verse 24, after he has acknowledged that she is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. It's a bit out of context right now. It'll make more sense later. In verse 25, it says, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So here in the story is where I kind of found it interesting that God goes out of his way to tell us that they're both naked. It means that God had intended for Adam and Eve to be naked. That is to say, he did not intend for them to be clothed. Genesis 3:11 actually backs that. We're going to spoil our story by moving over a chapter. None of us know how any of this goes. In verse 11 it says, who told you that you were naked? So there's an implication here that God did not intend for them to know about the idea of nakedness. And at this point, God had not created clothing for either of them. Now, the word naked here means, in a literal sense, nude, unclothed. It also means bare. It implies a physical, mental, and spiritual purity and innocence. And as we'll learn later, a vulnerability along with it. It is the same word that is used in Job 1:21 when Job says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The reason this is important is because we can draw the parallel that God intended for us to be spiritually naked in the same way that he intended for Adam and Eve to be physically naked. John 3:5 likens baptism to a type of rebirth. At baptism, we are spiritually naked again, in the same context of how Job was speaking to the physical side. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. With the same type of purity on the spiritual side that Adam and Eve had physically at creation. Now, before eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve had no concept of shame as it relates to their nakedness. And it says that in chapter 2:25. They were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. When we are in line with God's instruction and teaching, we are at peace. There is no shame. We don't feel vulnerability toward God. But in chapter 3, we see the fall of Adam and Eve. We see Satan begin to introduce doubt into the mind of Eve. So let's go on to chapter 3. Verse 2, she says, we may eat of all of these, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, you shall not eat it. The serpent said, you will not die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So they made the decision to eat. In verse 6, the woman saw that it was good for food, pleasant to the eyes. She ate it. She gave it to Adam, and he ate it. And in verse 7, immediately after that, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. So we have this idea that once they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they disobeyed God's instructions, they immediately saw their nakedness. And in shame, they immediately covered up. But who were they covering up for? I don't believe it was for each other, because in 2:25 or 2:24, it gives the instruction, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, they shall become one flesh. There was no physical shame between Adam and Eve, but there was between Adam, Eve, and God at the point of disobedience and eating of that tree. The feelings wouldn't have been felt toward each other if the two were one flesh. And we also see this in verse 8 and verse 10 of chapter 3. Verse 8, they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees in the garden. God called to Adam, said, where are you? In verse 10, he said, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid. Why? Because I was naked, and I hid myself. So what we learn here is that sin leads to shame. To be spiritually naked is to be vulnerable, exposed, authentic. There is no hiding when being spiritually naked. But like Adam and Eve, through sin and disobedience to God, we are introduced to shame. And our instinct is to cover that shame, to create and sew together spiritual fig leaves to cover our nakedness before God. I like to quote from Warren Buffett. He said, only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. Which brings forth an analogy that fits along with this, and it's an idea of being inappropriately clothed. It is possible to become so comfortable with who you are that you lose touch of social norms. We've all seen somebody walking around in public who is dressed really inappropriately. And the first thing that comes to mind is, well, if I were that person, I don't think I would be wearing that. But you can lose touch with social norms. And there are people who walk around spiritually exposed, dressed inappropriately. And that shouldn't be the case. Being spiritually naked is not about walking around unabashedly in our sin. It's about humbly striving to be like our elder brother, perfect in every good work. There is a humility in following God's instructions and Christ's example. Now, as I alluded to earlier, the idea for this message and study came from a single verse, and it is chapter 3:21. Because after all of this, after God gets mad and says, who told you about this? What is it you've done? The Lord hands out the punishments to them. And after all of that, 21, also for Adam and his wife, the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them. I found it really interesting that after all of that, God had mercy on them and covered the nakedness that they learned about, that he had no intent of them ever knowing about to begin with. And he does the same for us spiritually. Even after all of the frustration that he has in our lives, he still has mercy and compassion on us and clothes us. He does not want us to sin. He never intended for us to have the knowledge of good and evil, but we do. And God is there for us when we stray from him. Isaiah 61, 7 and 10 gives us the idea of how we are clothed. Isaiah 61. And I wanted to start in verse 7 because it actually speaks of shame. And it says in Isaiah 61:7, instead of your shame, you shall have double honor, and instead of confusion, they shall rejoice in their portion. And in verse 10, it speaks to the clothing. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My soul shall be joyful in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. The world-renowned orator, Emmitt Smith, who some of you may know from his Hall of Fame career with the Dallas Cowboys, once said, "We are all born naked into this world, but each of us is fully clothed in potential." And I think that that is such a true statement, especially as it pertains to our spiritual walk. Just as he intended with Adam and Eve, God has created us to be spiritually naked, to be bare, authentic, and vulnerable as we humbly follow his instruction. But mankind cannot uneat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You can't put that genie back in the bottle, so to speak. And as such, we have been introduced to the shame that comes from disobedience. The serpent was right in Genesis 3:5 that our eyes would be opened and we would know good and evil. But knowledge of sin brings culpability, which is what makes God's gift of grace even more powerful, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And God alone, in pure love and mercy, covers our shame, clothing us in garments of salvation and the robe of righteousness.